The heartbreaking truth, 30 years lost and found. A family story you won't forget. In today's video, we dive deep into a family story like no other. A son discovers the truth about his mother after 30 long years. Watch as emotions unfold in this heartwarming and emotional journey of love, reunion, and forgiveness. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Stories TH for more incredible family stories. A life reclaimed, the shocking truth unveiled. It was just another ordinary day for Mark, a man who was no stranger to the long hours of work and exhaustion. As he drove home that evening, the quiet of the night was broken by a sudden, inexplicable jolt. A woman darted out into the street in front of him. Instinctively, Mark slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. His heart raced as the car swerved, and in the flickering headlights, he caught a glimpse of her face. A face that stopped him cold. It was a woman, trembling, her hands outstretched in an almost apologetic gesture. But what made Mark's heart stop wasn't just the strange way she stood in the middle of the road. It was the unmistakable, striking resemblance to his mother. The woman's features mirrored those of his mother, the woman who had mysteriously vanished 30 years ago without a trace. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Could this woman, standing there like a shadow of her former self, really be his mother, Linda? He had spent years grappling with the pain and confusion of her disappearance, never knowing what had truly happened to her. And now, this woman, standing before him in rags, with wild eyes, looked exactly like the mother he had lost. Mark's confusion only deepened when the woman, her eyes empty with fear, spoke to him. She stammered, her voice weak and trembling. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." The words echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. Lock her up again? Mark couldn't comprehend what she was saying. His heart sank as he tried to make sense of this situation. He stepped out of the car, the urge to help overwhelming him, but he also felt the weight of fear, anxiety, and disbelief. Was this really his mother? How had she ended up in this state? Why was she homeless, seemingly lost, and afraid of being locked away? Mark was torn between his desire to help and the overwhelming emotional storm that churned inside him. He helped the woman into the car, and though his mind was racing, he knew he had to get answers. He took her to the hospital, hoping to uncover the truth. But at that moment, he had no idea just how much his life and his understanding of his own family was about to change. At the hospital, Mark felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. He sat in the waiting room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and fear. The woman, still silent but trembling, clung to him as though he were the only lifeline she had. When the doctor confirmed the results of a DNA test the next day, the world Mark thought he knew shattered. The woman was indeed Linda, his mother. She had been missing for 30 years, and the reality of what had happened to her was more devastating than Mark could have ever imagined. Linda hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She had been committed to a psychiatric institution by none other than Mark's father, George. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. His father had not only lied to him all these years, but had kept his mother locked away from him, from the world, for reasons that seemed as cruel as they were incomprehensible. Why had his father done this? Why had he kept his mother from him for so long? With the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Mark set out to uncover the full truth. He dug through hospital records, gathering evidence that pointed directly to his father's role in his mother's suffering. The truth was ugly, heartbreaking, and beyond anything Mark had ever imagined. His father, George, had signed the documents to have Linda committed, labeling her as mentally ill, despite the fact that she had never shown any signs of illness. It was clear that George had acted out of ambition, seeing Linda as an obstacle to his career, someone he deemed too weak to be his wife. Mark's heart burned with anger as he realized that his father had not only robbed him of his mother, but had also stolen her freedom for the sake of his own selfish desires. Mark's emotions were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He knew he couldn't let this go. The journey to confront his father and demand justice was not an easy one, but Mark was determined. He pressed forward, seeking legal recourse, filing lawsuits, and gathering all the evidence he could to expose his father's monstrous actions. With the help of a skilled lawyer, Alexander, Mark set the wheels of justice in motion. The case against his father gained traction, and soon it was picked up by the media. George's reputation, built on years of manipulating those around him, began to crumble under the weight of his own cruelty. The public outrage against George was intense, and the pressure built as more and more people began to see him for the man he truly was. The day of the trial arrived, and Mark stood in the courtroom, his heart heavy with both anger and anticipation. As he faced his father, George remained cold and unrepentant, still defending his actions as if they were justified. But Mark wasn't backing down. He stood firm and spoke the truth, the painful truth he had carried with him for so many years. His voice trembled with rage as he confronted his father. "You didn't protect our family. You destroyed it. You stole my mother's life, and you made me grow up without her." His words reverberated through the courtroom, and George's arrogance began to crumble. Despite his attempts to justify his actions, George could not escape the truth. The trial was a turning point, not just for Mark, but for Linda as well. After 30 years of living in darkness and fear, she was finally free. The moment Mark and his mother stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the years seemed to lift. They had fought for justice, and they had won. Mark and Linda had not only reclaimed the truth, but also found each other again. Their lives, though scarred by the past, could now move forward. Together, they began the process of healing. Mark helped Linda rebuild her life, giving her the support she needed to regain her confidence and strength. In the warmth of their new home, they slowly began to reclaim the joy and peace that had been stolen from them. Mark had finally forgiven himself for not being able to protect his mother, and Linda began to heal from the abuse she had endured. The journey was long, and the scars would never fully fade, but for the first time in years, Mark and Linda were free from the chains of their past. As they walked hand in hand through a quiet park, their future was full of hope. They had fought for justice, and now they had found peace. A son's fight for justice. The long road to healing. Mark's life had been shaped by the absence of his mother, Linda, who disappeared when he was just a child. The years that followed were filled with confusion, pain, and an unyielding desire for answers. His father, George, never spoke of her disappearance, and the holes in Mark's memories only deepened. He had grown up with the constant ache of wondering what happened to the woman who gave him life, the woman who had once been his world. But all of that was about to change on an ordinary night that would shatter everything Mark had ever known. Driving home from work, Mark's routine evening was interrupted by a sudden jolt. A woman ran into the street, and instinctively, Mark slammed on the brakes. The car swerved dangerously close to her, and for a moment, Mark thought he might have just narrowly avoided a tragic accident. But when the headlights illuminated her face, his heart stopped. There, standing in front of him, was a woman who looked exactly like his mother. Linda, the mother he had thought was lost to him forever. His mind raced as confusion and disbelief swept over him. Could it really be her? The woman who had been missing for 30 years? Mark couldn't just drive away. The resemblance was undeniable, and something inside him told him to find out more, to get answers he had spent decades searching for. As he stepped out of the car, the woman looked at him with a blank, haunted expression. Her eyes were filled with fear, and she whispered in a trembling voice, "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." Mark froze. The words made no sense. What had she meant by, "lock me up again"? His heart sank as his memories of a childhood filled with questions about his mother came flooding back. What had happened to her all these years? And why did she look so frightened? Why had she been abandoned? And why was she now standing before him, trembling and broken? He helped her into the car, his heart heavy with both concern and dread. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He needed answers. His mind was clouded with fear, worry, and confusion as he rushed to the hospital, hoping for some clarity. At the hospital, Mark's anxiety grew as the doctor ran the tests. Linda, the woman he had longed to find, was alive, but barely. The test results confirmed what he had feared. It was his mother. She had been locked away in a mental institution for 30 years, all because of his father's decision. George had committed Linda to the psychiatric facility all those years ago, under the guise of protecting the family. But the truth was far darker. The weight of the revelation was unbearable. George, the man who had once been his hero, the man who had raised him, was the very one who had torn their family apart. He had signed the papers to have his mother institutionalized, not because she was ill, but because she didn't fit his ambitious, ruthless vision of their life. She was too weak for his carefully constructed world. Mark's anger surged as he learned the truth about his father's betrayal. For 30 years, his mother had suffered in silence, locked away and isolated from the world, while George continued to live his life, free from the consequences of his cruelty. But Mark wasn't about to let this go. He needed to hold George accountable for his actions. He began the arduous process of gathering evidence, hospital records, documents, and witness testimonies, anything that would prove the truth about his father's role in his mother's torment. Mark contacted Alexander, a lawyer with experience in complex cases, and together they launched a legal battle against George. As the case gained traction, the media began to pick up the story, and the public's perception of George changed dramatically. The man who had once been a revered businessman was now being exposed for what he truly was, a manipulative, cruel man who had sacrificed his wife for the sake of his career. The pressure on George was mounting. As the evidence against him piled up, his reputation crumbled. No longer able to hide behind his wealth and power, George was forced to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Mark and Linda continued to face their own emotional struggles. Although Linda was slowly recovering from the physical and psychological trauma she had endured, the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. But for the first time in years, Mark could finally breathe. He had exposed the truth, and his mother was no longer living in fear. The trial day arrived, and Mark stood in the courtroom, filled with a mixture of anger, relief, and anticipation. Facing his father for the first time since the truth had come to light, Mark's anger was palpable. George remained cold and indifferent, offering no apology or remorse for his actions. But Mark wasn't backing down. With the support of Linda, who had finally found the courage to stand beside him, Mark confronted his father. "You didn't protect our family, you destroyed it," Mark said, his voice firm, filled with the weight of 30 years of pain. The room was silent as the final battle for justice unfolded. After the trial, George was found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and cruel treatment. His punishment was long overdue, but for Mark and Linda, it was only a small step toward healing. George was no longer the powerful, untouchable figure he once was, and Mark finally had the chance to rebuild his relationship with his mother. Though the wounds of the past would never fully heal, Mark was determined to make things right for Linda. They moved into a new home, one filled with love, peace, and the promise of a brighter future. Mark's journey had been one of pain, betrayal, and rage, but it was also a journey of forgiveness and love. His mother, once trapped in the darkness of her past, began to find herself again. She enrolled in classes, began socializing, and slowly reclaimed the life that had been stolen from her. Mark continued to support her, sharing her story to inspire others who had suffered in silence. Together, they rebuilt their lives, finding strength in their bond and offering hope to others who had been through similar hardships. As time passed, Linda grew stronger, and Mark learned to forgive both his father and himself. The truth had set them free, and now Mark and Linda could finally move forward, free from the shadows of the past. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For Mark, the most important lesson was that no matter how broken life may seem, love and forgiveness have the power to heal and the strength to overcome any obstacle. A journey of betrayal, justice, and healing, reclaiming a mother's lost life. Mark had always carried the heavy burden of missing his mother, Linda, who vanished when he was just a young boy. For decades, his life had been shaped by the unanswered questions surrounding her disappearance and the emotional void left in her absence. His father, George, had never spoken a word about what had happened to her, leaving Mark to grow up in a home filled with silence, lies, and the deep pain of not knowing the truth. The years dragged on, and Mark tried to live with the emptiness, but his heart always longed for the woman who had been taken from him. Then, on an ordinary evening that Mark would never forget, his life was thrown into chaos. After a long day of work, Mark was driving home, lost in thought, when a woman suddenly dashed into the middle of the road. Startled, Mark slammed on the brakes, his car swerving dangerously close to her. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. As the headlights illuminated her face, a cold wave of shock washed over him. The woman standing before him was a near-perfect replica of Linda, the mother he had thought was gone forever. For a moment, Mark couldn't breathe, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It couldn't be her, could it? The woman's presence was almost otherworldly. Her eyes empty, her hands trembling, and her voice barely a whisper, full of fear and confusion. As she muttered, "Don't take me, don't lock me up again." Mark felt his entire world collapse. The words made no sense, but they haunted him. What had happened to his mother? Why was she so terrified? Why had she been living like this, a shadow of the woman Mark remembered from his childhood? Linda had been missing for 30 years, and now she was standing in front of him, a broken, homeless soul. The realization hit Mark hard. He couldn't accept it. His mother couldn't have turned into this woman someone living on the streets, abused and traumatized. Mark helped her into his car, his heart heavy with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and concern. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't just leave her there. He needed answers. His mind raced as he drove to the hospital, hoping that somehow they could confirm the woman's identity and help her. At the hospital, after a few quick tests, the truth came crashing down. The woman Mark had found on the street was, without a doubt, Linda, his mother. But she wasn't the vibrant woman he remembered. She had been locked away in a mental institution for 30 years, abandoned by the very man who had once promised to protect her. Mark felt as if the ground beneath him had been ripped away. The woman he had spent his life searching for had been right there all along, locked away in a psychiatric facility, trapped by his father's cold, cruel decision. George, his father, had committed Linda to the institution, not because she was mentally ill, but because she didn't fit into his ambitions. George had wanted a wife who would support his career and help him climb the social ladder. Linda, in his eyes, was too weak to be the partner he needed. So he locked her away, isolating her from her family, from Mark, for 30 years. Mark's anger and heartbreak surged as he learned the truth. The man he had once looked up to, his father, had destroyed their family for the sake of his own ambitions. But Mark wasn't about to let this go. The truth had been exposed, but now he needed to make sure his father paid for the harm he had caused. Mark began researching the legal avenues to bring George to justice. He contacted a lawyer, Alexander, who specialized in complex cases, and together they began gathering evidence. Mark obtained hospital records, testimonies from nurses, and any documentation that could prove his father's wrongdoing. The legal battle was long and grueling, but Mark was determined. He wasn't just fighting for justice for his mother, he was fighting to reclaim the life that had been stolen from both of them. As the case gained public attention, George's reputation, once built on power and influence, began to crumble. The media latched onto the story, and the world learned the truth about the businessman who had locked his wife away for 30 years. The public outrage was palpable, and George couldn't hide behind his wealth and connections anymore. The pressure on him mounted, and soon, George found himself facing legal consequences for his actions. The courtroom became the battleground where Mark and his mother would finally confront the man who had caused them so much pain. The trial was emotionally intense. Mark stood before his father, heart full of rage and sorrow, as he demanded justice. George remained cold, unrepentant, and indifferent, as if none of it mattered to him. But Mark wasn't backing down. With the support of Linda, who had finally found the courage to stand beside him, Mark confronted George in the courtroom. "You didn't protect our family. You destroyed it," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with fury. The room fell silent, and Mark knew that the truth was finally being revealed. George could no longer hide behind his lies. In the end, George was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and cruel treatment toward his wife. He had to pay for what he had done, but for Mark and Linda, the victory wasn't about seeing George punished. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from them. Linda would never be the same. The trauma she had endured was too deep to erase, but at least she could finally begin to heal. Mark and Linda moved into a new home, one filled with warmth, love, and the promise of a fresh start. Over time, Linda began to rediscover joy in life. She enrolled in art classes, met new friends, and slowly began to rebuild her sense of self. Mark, too, found healing. He shared his mother's story with others, helping to inspire those who had suffered similar pain. Together, they showed that love, forgiveness, and perseverance could heal even the deepest wounds. Despite everything they had been through, they found strength in each other. They had overcome the darkness of their past, and now they were building a future filled with hope. The road to healing was long, but it was worth it. For Mark and Linda, the greatest victory was the freedom to live a life filled with love and peace, no longer haunted by the past. A tale of lost love, betrayal, and redemption, a son's journey to reclaim his mother's life. Daniel had lived a life marked by an unspoken void, an emptiness he had carried with him since his mother, Martha, mysteriously disappeared when he was just a boy. Raised by his father, Greg, Daniel was always told that his mother had left them without any explanation. The trauma of her sudden absence haunted Daniel for years, leaving him with an aching sense of abandonment that his father could never fully understand. Over the years, the questions about what had really happened to Martha continued to plague him, but his father remained tight-lipped, offering no answers, only perpetuating the mystery of her disappearance. That all changed one fateful evening when Daniel, now an adult, was driving home from work, tired and weary after a long day. As he drove through a quiet street, his car suddenly jolted as a figure darted into the road in front of him. Startled, he slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The figure was a woman, ragged, disheveled, and standing frozen in the middle of the road. Her hand trembled, as if trying to apologize, but what caught Daniel off guard was the woman's face. When the headlights of his car illuminated her features, Daniel felt a sudden, cold rush of disbelief. The woman looked eerily familiar. Her face mirrored the woman he had spent his whole life yearning for, his mother, Martha. For a moment, Daniel's heart stopped. Could this really be his mother? He had spent 30 long years mourning her loss, never once imagining she might still be alive. But the resemblance was undeniable, and his mind raced with 1,000 questions. As he rushed to help the woman, his shock deepened. She looked terrified, her hands shaking violently as she muttered words that made no sense. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again," she pleaded. Those words felt like a punch to Daniel's gut. What was she saying? And why was she so scared? Daniel's mind spun as he helped the woman into his car, trying to make sense of what was happening. She was weak, fragile, and her eyes were vacant, as if haunted by years of unimaginable suffering. He couldn't reconcile the image of the woman who once held him close as a child with the broken person sitting next to him in the car. His mother had been missing for so long, yet here she was alive, but trapped in a state of shock and fear that Daniel could not understand. He took her to the hospital, hoping against hope that this could be some kind of mistake, that the woman in his car wasn't really his mother. After a series of tests and scans, the truth came crashing down. The woman was indeed Martha, his mother, but she had been locked away for decades in a mental institution, her life destroyed by Greg, Daniel's father. The revelation shattered Daniel's world. His father had signed the papers to commit Martha to a psychiatric facility when Daniel was just a boy. It wasn't that Martha had been mentally ill, she had simply not met the expectations Greg had for her. She wasn't the strong, ambitious woman he wanted by his side. Instead of supporting his career and standing by him as a partner, Martha had been deemed weak in Greg's eyes. And so she was sent away, locked in a cold, isolated facility, out of sight, out of mind. The realization left Daniel reeling with a mixture of grief, fury, and confusion. He couldn't believe that his father, the man who had been his hero, had destroyed their family in this way. For years, Daniel had been led to believe that his mother had abandoned them, and now he knew the painful truth that Greg had orchestrated her imprisonment, leaving her to suffer in silence for 30 years. Why hadn't he known? Why had his father never told him the truth? Greg had twisted the narrative, making Daniel believe his mother had simply walked away. But now, the truth was out, and it was uglier than Daniel could have ever imagined. Determined to make sure that justice was served, Daniel sought legal counsel. He needed to know why this had happened and how Greg could have gotten away with this betrayal for so many years. The legal battle that followed was long and grueling. With the help of a dedicated lawyer, Daniel began the process of reopening the case. Hospital records, medical documents, and testimonies from former staff members at the psychiatric institution helped build a case against his father. The more Daniel uncovered, the more his anger grew. His father had not only imprisoned his mother, but had destroyed their family. The lies, the deceit, the years of emotional torment, it was all too much to bear. The public began to take notice as the case gained momentum. Media outlets picked up the story, and soon, Greg was no longer the respected businessman he once was. The truth about his cruelty was being exposed for all to see, and the public backlash was fierce. But despite the mounting evidence, Greg remained cold and indifferent, refusing to take responsibility for his actions. Daniel's anger reached a boiling point. His father's lack of remorse only fueled his resolve. This fight wasn't just about seeking justice for his mother, it was about reclaiming the dignity and life that had been stolen from them both. The trial was a culmination of years of pain and anguish, and for Daniel, it was the moment when he would confront his father. Standing in the courtroom, facing the man who had caused so much harm, Daniel spoke with a voice that was steady but filled with fury. "You destroyed our family," he said, looking directly at Greg. "You locked my mother away for 30 years, and I will not let you get away with it." Greg remained unyielding, his expression unchanged, as he continued to justify his actions. But Daniel wasn't backing down. "You didn't protect us. You destroyed us," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The trial continued with testimony after testimony, each one more damning than the last. Greg's once glorious reputation was shattered, and the truth was undeniable. In the end, Greg was found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and cruelty toward his wife. The man who had once been at the top of his world was now facing the consequences of his actions. Though the verdict brought Daniel a sense of relief, it wasn't enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on his family. His mother would never be the same. The trauma she had endured could never be undone. But she was free now, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. Daniel moved her into a new home, a place where she could finally find peace. With time, Martha slowly began to heal, finding comfort in the love and care that Daniel provided. The journey was long, but with Daniel by her side, she learned to trust again, to laugh again, and to reclaim the life she had once been robbed of. Together, they rebuilt their lives, one small step at a time. The wounds of the past could never be fully erased, but they found solace in knowing that justice had been served. For Daniel, the road to healing was not just about seeking revenge. It was about finding peace, forgiveness, and ultimately, love. A journey of forgiveness, justice, and healing. A son's fight for his mother's freedom. For 30 years, James had lived with the haunting absence of his mother, Charlotte. The day she disappeared had left a hole in his heart that no one, not even his father, could fill. Raised by his father, Henry, James had always believed that his mother had simply abandoned them. Over the years, Henry had brushed off James's questions about her, claiming that Charlotte had left them for reasons he would never fully understand. James's father had raised him alone, and despite the apparent stability of their life, the lingering absence of his mother cast a dark shadow over everything. One evening, as James drove home from work, his mind swirled with thoughts of the past. He was lost in thought when suddenly a figure darted into the street in front of him. He slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. The figure, a woman, was standing still in the middle of the road. At first, James couldn't make out her features, but when his headlights illuminated her face, his breath caught in his throat. The woman's face was eerily familiar. His heart stopped. It couldn't be. Could it? The woman looked exactly like his mother. The image of Charlotte, a picture he had cherished from his childhood, flashed before his eyes. James stepped out of the car, the confusion in his mind growing by the second. He approached the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. There she was, standing before him, trembling, as if she was afraid of something or someone. Her clothes were tattered, and her face was gaunt and tired, but the resemblance was undeniable. His mother, whom he had believed to be lost forever, stood before him in the flesh. But why was she like this? Why was she homeless, a shadow of the woman he remembered? Why had she disappeared from his life all those years ago? As he helped her into the car, he felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, confusion, anger, and disbelief. He couldn't understand what had happened, but he knew he had to find out. He drove her to the hospital, hoping to uncover some explanation. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Why had his mother been left in such a terrible state? Why hadn't she reached out to him? Had his father known about her all this time? James wasn't sure he wanted the answers, but he knew he couldn't leave things unresolved. The doctor ran tests on her, and after what felt like an eternity, the truth was revealed. The woman he had brought in was indeed his mother, Charlotte, and she had been locked away in a psychiatric institution for the past 30 years. She had been imprisoned by his father, Henry. The truth hit James like a ton of bricks. Henry, the man James had trusted, had signed the papers that sent Charlotte to the institution. For 3 decades, James had lived with the lie that his mother had abandoned him, but in reality, his father had orchestrated her removal from their lives. The motive was clear. Henry had sent Charlotte to the institution because she didn't meet his expectations. She was not the strong, ambitious woman he needed to support his career. Instead of being a partner in his life, Charlotte was seen as weak and incapable. And so, Henry had her committed, locked away in a place where she would be forgotten, a prisoner in a world of silence. The betrayal was unbearable. James couldn't comprehend how his father could do such a thing. He had grown up with the belief that his mother had left them, but now he knew the truth. Henry had condemned his mother to a life of suffering, and for 30 years, James had been kept in the dark. His childhood memories came rushing back, those long, painful nights when he wondered where his mother was and why no one ever spoke of her. Now, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. His father had been the one to break their family, to break him. James was overwhelmed with grief, anger, and a sense of profound betrayal. Determined to bring justice to his mother, James began to investigate. He reached out to a lawyer, Daniel, who helped him gather the necessary evidence. The hospital records, the medical documents, and the testimonies of former staff members at the psychiatric institution painted a damning picture. Henry's actions were not just cruel, they were illegal. Charlotte had never been mentally ill. She had been a victim of her husband's ambition. Henry had used his power to silence her and destroy their family. James worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing for a legal battle that would expose the truth. The case began to attract media attention, and soon the public learned of Henry's crimes. The man who had once been admired for his success and wealth was now seen in a completely different light. His reputation crumbled as more details about his abuse of power came to light. Henry remained indifferent, refusing to show any remorse for his actions, but James was determined to make sure his father paid for what he had done. The more he uncovered, the more his anger grew. This wasn't just about seeking revenge for the years of pain Henry had caused. It was about ensuring that Charlotte's suffering would not be forgotten, and that Henry would face the consequences of his cruelty. The trial was a long and painful process. As James stood in the courtroom, facing his father, he realized that this moment would define the rest of his life. The man he had once admired stood before him, unyielding and cold. But this time, James wouldn't back down. "You destroyed our family," he said, his voice steady with anger. "You locked my mother away for 30 years, and I won't let you get away with it." Henry didn't flinch. His eyes remained cold, indifferent to the pain he had caused. But James didn't need his father's acknowledgement or apology. He had the truth on his side, and that was all that mattered. In the end, Henry was found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and cruelty toward Charlotte. The years of deceit and betrayal finally caught up with him. James felt a sense of relief, but it wasn't the satisfaction he had hoped for. The years of pain couldn't be undone by a verdict. His mother would never be the same. But at least she was free now, free from the prison that Henry had created for her. With Charlotte's health improving, James did everything he could to support her. He rented a small apartment for them to start over, a place where she could live without fear, a place where they could rebuild their lives. Charlotte slowly began to heal, and with James's support, she rediscovered joy in life. It wasn't easy, and there were many days when the scars of the past seemed too deep to overcome. But James and Charlotte found strength in each other. Together, they learned that love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. and that no matter how broken their past was, they had the power to rebuild a new future. As the days passed, Charlotte found peace. She enrolled in art classes, connected with new friends, and began to live the life she had been denied for so long. James also found healing in helping others. He started a community project to support abused women, giving them the strength to reclaim their lives, just as his mother had done. Charlotte became an inspiration to others, a symbol of resilience and hope. And through it all, James remained by her side, the son who had fought for justice and given his mother the chance to live again. Their story is one of heartbreak, justice, and the healing power of love. It shows that, no matter the darkness of the past, the future is full of possibilities if we are brave enough to fight for what's right. A son's journey for truth, uncovering the past and finding peace. For 30 years, David lived with the unanswered question of where his mother, Margaret, had gone. When he was just a boy, she disappeared without a trace, leaving him to grow up under the cold, distant care of his father, Richard. As time passed, David grew older, and the mystery surrounding his mother's disappearance only deepened. His father always had an answer for everything, but it never quite made sense to David. The stories Richard told painted a picture of a mother who had simply abandoned her family, a story that never sat right with David. He had always longed to know the truth, but no matter how many times he asked, Richard's answers never seemed to add up. He spent years of his life questioning the void his mother left behind, but the answers never came. Then one night, while driving home after a long day, David experienced something that would forever change his life. As he navigated the quiet streets, his headlights suddenly illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 40s, stood frozen in the street, her eyes empty, her body trembling. At first, David couldn't make out her face, but as he stepped out of the car to check on her, the headlights caught her features, and in that moment, everything stopped. The woman's face was unmistakable. It looked just like his mother. David's heart began to race as the shock washed over him. How could this be? Margaret, who had been gone for so long, was standing right in front of him, but she was no longer the mother he remembered. She looked broken, her clothes tattered, her face gaunt, and her eyes filled with fear. As she stumbled toward him, she muttered something that sent chills down David's spine. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." The words didn't make sense at first, but David's heart sank as his mind raced for answers. Why was she here, in such a miserable condition? What had happened to her all these years? David's world felt like it was unraveling as he struggled to make sense of the scene in front of him. How could his mother have gone from being a loving, strong woman to this fragile shell of a person? His mind was filled with confusion and anxiety, but there was one thing he knew for sure: he needed answers. He helped her into his car and rushed to the hospital, hoping for some kind of clarity. But as the hospital staff began their examination, David felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. How could his mother have been living this way all these years, and why hadn't he known? Why hadn't anyone told him? The doctor's words were like a slap to the face. Margaret had been held in a psychiatric institution for the past 3 decades, locked away without her consent. The pain and disbelief that David felt in that moment were almost unbearable. How could his father have done this to her? For 30 years, Richard had kept the truth from him, and for 30 years, Margaret had lived in a prison of her own. David's anger began to build inside him as the reality of the situation sank in. His mother had been taken from him, not because she abandoned him, but because Richard had made the decision to lock her away for his own selfish reasons. Richard, a wealthy and influential man, had committed his wife to a psychiatric facility because she didn't meet his standards. He had abandoned her, locking her away in the name of his career and social status. Margaret wasn't mentally ill. She had simply been too weak in Richard's eyes to be the woman he needed her to be. David had spent years blaming his mother for leaving him, but in reality, it was his father who had ripped her away from him. The realization was like a punch to the gut. The lies, the secrecy, the betrayal, everything David had been taught to believe about his mother was a lie. Determined to find out the full extent of what had happened, David began searching through old hospital records and documents. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Richard had been the one to sign the papers that sent Margaret to the psychiatric institution. He had made the decision without consulting David or anyone else, and for all these years, he had hidden the truth from his son. Richard had believed he could justify his actions by telling David that his mother had simply left them, but now the truth was clear. He had stolen David's childhood and shattered their family. David was consumed with a sense of betrayal and anger, but he refused to let it go. He couldn't just let his father escape responsibility for what he had done. He contacted a lawyer, Lena, who helped him gather the necessary evidence to reopen the case. With the documents, the testimonies, and the support of witnesses, David was ready to bring his father to justice. The case gained public attention, and soon the media began covering the story. Richard's reputation, which he had built for years, began to crumble as the truth came to light. People who had once admired him started to distance themselves, and public outrage mounted. The courtroom battle was long and intense. Richard sat stoically, refusing to show any emotion as the charges against him were read aloud. But David was determined. He stood in front of his father, his voice steady but filled with anger, and said, "You didn't protect this family, you destroyed it." The courtroom was silent as the weight of David's words hung in the air. Richard didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, he muttered something about protecting the family. But David wasn't having it. "You locked my mother away for 30 years, he shot back, his voice rising. "You destroyed our family for your own gain. You're no longer the man I once admired." The truth had been exposed, the evidence was undeniable, and Richard was found guilty. David felt a sense of relief, but it wasn't the victory he had hoped for. The damage had already been done. His mother would never be the same, and the pain of the past could never be erased. But at least Margaret was free. She no longer had to live in fear or isolation. David did everything he could to help her rebuild her life. He rented a small apartment for them to start fresh, and slowly, Margaret began to heal. She found comfort in art classes and began to build a network of supportive friends. David helped her reconnect with life, showing her that despite the darkness of her past, there was still joy to be found. In the end, David realized that the road to healing wasn't just about seeking justice for the wrongs done to his mother, it was about helping her find peace and reclaim her life. Margaret had gone through unspeakable pain, but with David's help, she was learning to live again. And as for David, he had learned that love, forgiveness, and perseverance were the keys to moving forward. Their lives would never be the same, but they had each other, and that was all that mattered. David and Margaret's journey was a painful one, but it was also one of growth, healing, and redemption. Despite the hardships they faced, they found strength in one another and began to build a new life filled with love and hope. And while the past would always be a part of them, they had learned that with love and forgiveness, they could overcome anything. The unthinkable truth, a son's journey to unveil the secrets of his mother's past. David had lived most of his life with one question constantly gnawing at him. What had happened to his mother, Margaret? She had disappeared from his life when he was just a child, leaving a void that no amount of time or effort could fill. Growing up with his father, Richard, David always felt something was off about his mother's disappearance, but the answers always seemed to elude him. Richard, a man of wealth and influence, painted a picture of a woman who simply walked away, abandoning her family without any explanation. But deep down, David never believed it. The stories never added up, and the more he asked, the more his father's answers seemed evasive and shallow. As the years passed, David tried to bury the pain of his mother's absence, but it always lingered in the back of his mind like a festering wound. One night, after a long, exhausting day at work, David was driving home when something unexpected happened. As he cruised through the quiet streets, his headlights suddenly caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. David swerved, slamming his foot on the brakes to avoid hitting the woman. For a moment, he couldn't see her face clearly, but there was something about her stance, her trembling hand waving at him almost apologetically, that made him feel uneasy. But when the headlights fully illuminated her face, it stopped him in his tracks. The woman standing before him had the unmistakable features of Margaret. Shock filled David's chest as he realized the woman looked exactly like his mother. But how could that be? Margaret had been missing for over 30 years. He felt his heart stop beating as his mind tried to process the impossibility of the situation. Was this really his mother? In a daze of confusion and disbelief, David stepped out of the car and approached the woman, his heart pounding with every step. As he got closer, he saw that she was in a pitiful tattered clothes, gaunt features, and eyes that seemed empty of hope. She looked like someone who had been abandoned and broken. The woman he once knew, now nothing more than a shell of herself. The woman muttered something under her breath. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again," her voice trembling with fear. David froze. What did she mean by that? "Lock me up again." He repeated those words in his head as his confusion deepened. What had happened to his mother all these years? Why had she been living like this, in such a terrible condition? A surge of anger and disbelief washed over David as he tried to make sense of the situation. His mother couldn't have turned into a homeless, frightened woman, but then again, this woman looked too much like her. The resemblance was undeniable. He felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and guileless memories of his childhood resurfaced. David had always felt abandoned by his mother, forced to grow up with a father who was cold, distant, and never forthcoming about the truth. Now, standing before him was a woman who looked like his mother, but she was broken, afraid, and in desperate need of help. David couldn't bear the thought of what she had endured. What had Richard done to her all these years? With a deep breath, David helped the woman into his car and drove her to the hospital, desperate for answers. Every minute felt like an eternity as questions raced through his mind. Why had his father kept his mother from him all these years? Why hadn't anyone told him the truth? The hospital staff quickly began examining the woman, and David was left in a state of anxiety. Every passing second made him feel like he was living in a nightmare. The doctor's words only added to his despair. After running some preliminary tests, the doctor confirmed that the woman was Margaret, his mother, and that she had been in a psychiatric institution for the past 30 years, locked away against her will. The shock hit David like a punch to the gut. His mother had been suffering, locked away in a mental institution, and he had no idea. His father had hidden the truth from him, allowing Margaret to suffer alone. David's anger boiled over as he demanded to know how his mother had ended up in such a terrible condition. The hospital staff informed him that his father, Richard, had been the one to commit Margaret to the psychiatric hospital, signing the papers that stripped her of her freedom. She hadn't been mentally ill. She had been forced into that institution because Richard didn't think she was strong enough for the life he envisioned. The words cut through David like a knife. His father had torn their family apart for the sake of his own ambitions. Determined to find out the full truth, David spent the next few days going through hospital records, seeking any documentation that would explain how his mother had ended up in that institution. Finally, he uncovered the devastating truth. It was Richard who had signed the papers for Margaret's commitment, citing her weakness as a reason for her institutionalization. David's heart broke as he read the documents. The man he had once admired, the man who had been his role model, had destroyed his family. He had torn Margaret away from him and had forced her to live a life of torment. David could no longer stand by and let his father get away with it. He contacted a lawyer, Lena, who helped him gather the evidence to reopen the case. The legal battle was long and grueling, but David was determined to get justice for his mother. As the case gained media attention, Richard's reputation began to crumble. The public, once in awe of his success, now turned against him. David's determination and his mother's strength made them both symbols of resilience, and the truth began to spread like wildfire. Finally, Richard was arrested, and the trial began. David stood tall in the courtroom, facing the man who had caused his family so much pain. His words were filled with anger and sorrow as he confronted his father. "You didn't protect this family. You destroyed it." The courtroom fell silent as David's words echoed through the room. Richard remained cold and detached, unable to comprehend the damage his actions had caused. The court found Richard guilty, and he was sentenced for his crimes. David, though relieved that justice had been served, knew the damage to his family could never be fully undone. His mother would never be the same, but at least she would no longer have to live in fear. David rented a small apartment for Margaret, where she could start over, free from the horrors of her past. In the years that followed, Margaret began to heal. She found comfort in art classes and made new friends, and David stood by her side, helping her rebuild her life. Together, they created a new beginning, free from the shadows of the past. David's journey had not only been about seeking justice for his mother, but about helping her rediscover her own strength. He had learned that love and forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds, and that, no matter what, family would always be there to support one another. Their story was one of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of truth. Though the past could never be erased, David and Margaret had found peace in the present, and together they walked into the future with hope and love. A family's darkest secret. Unveiled, the journey to justice and healing. David had always known something was wrong with the story of his mother's disappearance. For years, he had lived with the haunting absence of Margaret, his mother, who vanished from his life when he was just a child. Raised by his father, Richard, David had heard 1,000 versions of why his mother had left, each explanation more insubstantial than the last. Richard, a man who was revered for his wealth and influence, had always claimed that Margaret simply walked away, never to return. But David never believed that. The lies never added up, and the more he asked, the more he felt that his father was hiding something darker. David spent his childhood wondering about his mother's fate, but as he grew older, the pain of the unknown became easier to push aside. He buried it beneath the weight of his own life, but it never quite disappeared. Every anniversary of her disappearance, every birthday, and every moment that marked her absence brought the same emptiness. Then, one night, everything changed. David was driving home after a long day of work when something unimaginable happened. As he turned a corner, a figure suddenly darted into the road, forcing him to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting her. The woman stood frozen, her trembling hand lifting in an almost apologetic wave. For a brief moment, David could not see her face, but as the headlights hit her, something in his heart stopped. His eyes locked onto the face before him, and his breath caught in his chest. There, standing in front of him, was a woman who looked unmistakably like Margaret. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. This woman, ragged, fearful, and clearly in distress, had the exact same face, the same eyes, the same smile as his mother. But how was that possible? Margaret had been missing for over 30 years. How could she be here now, standing in front of him in such a pitiful state? David's mind raced as a flood of emotions hit him all at once: confusion, disbelief, anger, and sorrow. His mother couldn't have become this shadow of herself. She had been a loving mother, a caring woman, someone who had never deserved to be abandoned. But here she was, a ghost of the woman he once knew. The woman's voice trembled as she said, "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." Those words, full of fear and trauma, echoed in David's mind as he struggled to understand what was happening. Why was she so terrified? Why did she think she would be locked up again? David helped her into the car, his heart heavy with dread and confusion. He decided to take her to the hospital, where he hoped doctors could provide some answers. As the car moved through the quiet streets, David's mind swirled with questions. He could hardly breathe, his body tense with anxiety. The woman was still silent, her head resting on his shoulder, trembling with exhaustion. He couldn't stop thinking. Could this really be his mother? Why hadn't she reached out to him all these years? Why hadn't he known the truth about her? The hospital staff immediately began running tests, and the doctor confirmed the unimaginable. The woman was, in fact, Margaret, David's mother. Shock hit David like a freight train. How could this be? For the past 30 years, he had believed she was lost forever, but now she was right here, barely alive and trapped in a state of complete vulnerability. The doctor's report revealed that Margaret had been in a psychiatric hospital for most of those years, committed by Richard, David's father. She had not been mentally ill, as David's father had claimed. Instead, Richard had made the decision to lock her away in an institution, deeming her too weak to be his wife and the mother he wanted her to be. David felt a burning rage surge through him as he learned the truth. His father had done this to her. Margaret had been suffering for decades, trapped by a man who valued his career and reputation more than the well-being of his wife and son. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, David realized that his entire life had been based on lies. His father, the man who he had once idolized, had not only abandoned his mother, but had taken away her freedom for his own selfish reasons. Determined to uncover the full extent of the truth, David embarked on a mission to find the hospital records and any documents that could reveal how his mother had ended up in that institution. It wasn't easy, but after some digging, David uncovered a document with Richard's signature, the signature that had authorized Margaret's admission to the psychiatric hospital. His mother had never chosen this life. Richard had stolen her freedom, and in doing so, had stolen David's childhood as well. David's heart shattered as he realized just how deeply his father had betrayed him and his mother. David sought legal counsel and began the painstaking process of reopening the case. With the help of a lawyer, Lena, and the evidence he had gathered, David fought to get justice for his mother. The case quickly gained media attention, and soon, Richard's reputation began to unravel. The once untouchable billionaire was now the subject of public outrage. David's determination and his mother's strength made them both symbols of resilience. The press and public began to turn against Richard, and the truth finally came to light. Richard was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, and a trial was set. David stood in the courtroom, facing the man who had destroyed his family. His words were sharp and full of anger as he confronted his father. "You didn't protect this family. You destroyed it." Richard, cold and indifferent, continued to justify his actions, but David would not back down. He had seen through his father's lies, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The trial ended with Richard being found guilty, and David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served, but there was no satisfaction in his victory, only relief. His mother's suffering would never be erased, but at least she was free now. David rented a small apartment for Margaret, where she could begin to heal. She slowly regained her health and confidence, with David by her side every step of the way. She began to find joy in simple things again, and David helped her rediscover the world she had been robbed of. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the past would never fully fade, but together, they started to rebuild their lives. In the years that followed, Margaret became an inspiration to others. She joined support groups for women who had suffered abuse and shared her story, helping others find strength and hope. David, too, found a new sense of purpose. He helped others by supporting organizations that assisted women who had been victims of abuse, ensuring that his mother's story would never be forgotten. Their journey was one of healing, forgiveness, and love. Despite the pain they had endured, David and Margaret found a way to move forward with a renewed sense of hope. They learned that no matter what darkness they had been through, love and resilience would always guide them toward the light. A son's journey to justice, uncovering his father's betrayal and his mother's freedom. David had lived a life haunted by the absence of his mother, Margaret, who disappeared when he was just a young child. For 30 years, the question of what happened to her lingered in his heart, unanswered. Raised by his father, Richard, David had been told countless versions of why his mother had left. Richard, a man of power and wealth, always claimed that Margaret had simply walked away. But deep down, David always suspected the truth was far more complicated. The lies were too neatly packaged, too convenient, and David's instincts told him that his father was hiding something darker. His childhood was filled with gaps, questions about where his mother had gone, why she had left him, and why his father had been so secretive. As time passed, those questions turned into painful memories. Memories of being abandoned by the one person who was supposed to love him unconditionally. His mother's absence left a void in his heart that never seemed to heal, and the more he asked about her, the more the silence grew. Then, one fateful night, as David was driving home after a long day at work, everything changed. As he rounded a corner, a figure suddenly darted into the street, forcing him to slam on the brakes. His heart raced as the car skidded and narrowly missed the woman. For a moment, David couldn't make out her features, but when the headlights hit her face, his heart stopped. There, standing before him, was a woman who looked eerily like his mother. His breath caught in his chest, and every muscle in his body went rigid. How could this be? Margaret had been missing for 30 years. How could a woman who looked exactly like her be standing in front of him now, in such a pitiful, tattered state? His mind spun with confusion and disbelief. His mother? Was it really her? The woman's appearance seemed so unreal, as if it were some cruel twist of fate. As the woman's trembling hand reached out, and her fearful voice muttered words that made no sense, "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." David's heart sank. What had happened to his mother? Why was she acting like this? He helped her into the car, but with each passing second, his heart grew heavier with dread. He couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. He decided to take her to the hospital, hoping that someone could help make sense of the situation. In the emergency room, the doctors ran tests, and after what felt like an eternity, the truth was revealed. The woman was Margaret, his mother. David was struck dumb by the revelation. For 30 years, he had lived with the emptiness of not knowing what had happened to her, only to find her in such a horrific state. She had been locked away in a psychiatric institution by none other than his father. Richard had signed the papers committing her to the hospital, and for all those years, Margaret had been kept in the shadows, tortured and abandoned by the very person who was supposed to protect her. David's world shattered. His father, the man he had once admired and looked up to, had destroyed their family. The anger and betrayal that had been simmering inside him for so long erupted into a storm of rage. His father had locked Margaret away because she was not the wife he wanted her to be. She was too weak for his ambitions. Richard had treated his wife as a tool, as something disposable, and for 30 years, Margaret had suffered in silence, her life stolen away by the man David had trusted most. The pain of it was unbearable. The more David uncovered, the more the weight of the betrayal crushed him. Determined to uncover the full truth, David sought out the records from the hospital where Margaret had been held. After an exhausting fight, he was able to obtain the documents that confirmed his worst fears. Richard had signed the order to commit his mother to the mental institution. Margaret had never been mentally ill. She had been the victim of a man who cared more about his career than his family. The cruelty and selfishness of Richard's actions cut through David's heart like a knife. The man who had been his father, the man who had raised him, had destroyed their lives. With this newfound knowledge, David knew he had to take action. He sought legal counsel and began the process of reopening the case. With the help of Lena, his lawyer, David gathered the evidence he needed to expose the truth. The case quickly gained media attention, and Richard's carefully crafted public image began to crumble. The media storm surrounding the trial only made Richard's position more precarious. The truth was now out in the open, and there was no escaping it. The man who had once been untouchable was now facing the consequences of his actions. The trial was set, and David stood in the courtroom facing his father. For years, he had lived with the pain of his mother's disappearance, but now he had the opportunity to make his father pay for what he had done. As Richard sat there, cold and emotionless, David's fury boiled over. He confronted his father with words that burned with truth. "You didn't protect this family. You destroyed it." Richard's defense was predictable, and his excuses were hollow. He had no remorse, no understanding of the suffering he had caused, but David was determined to make sure that justice was served. The courtroom was filled with the weight of Margaret's suffering. With witness testimonies, documents, and medical records, the case against Richard was undeniable. And yet, even in the face of the evidence, he refused to acknowledge his wrongs. Richard was found guilty, and though his arrogance remained unshaken, the verdict marked the beginning of his downfall. For David, there was no satisfaction in seeing his father convicted. The years of pain could not be undone, but justice had been served. Margaret was no longer a prisoner in the shadows of her past. She had regained her freedom, and with that freedom came the opportunity to rebuild her life. David rented a small apartment for her, and as Margaret slowly recovered, they began to rebuild their relationship. The healing process was slow, but with David's unwavering support, Margaret began to regain her strength. Over time, Margaret became a symbol of hope and resilience. She joined support groups for women who had suffered abuse, sharing her story and helping others find their strength. David, too, found new purpose in helping others. He used his mother's story to inspire others to stand up against injustice and to help those who had suffered like she had. Though their lives would never be the same, David and Margaret found peace together. They learned that no matter how painful the past, love and forgiveness had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Richard could no longer control them, and they were free to live their lives on their own terms. For David, the journey to justice was not just about exposing his father's cruelty, but about learning to let go of the past and to embrace a future filled with love and forgiveness. They had suffered, but together they had found a new path, one of healing, hope, and the promise of a better tomorrow. A son's quest for justice, the uncovering of a dark family secret. For most of his life, David had been haunted by the absence of his mother, Ellen, who had disappeared when he was just a young boy. Raised by his father, Richard, David grew up with a void in his heart, constantly asking questions about his mother's disappearance. Richard's answers were always vague, always evasive, and David's suspicions grew over the years. He could never shake the feeling that his father wasn't telling him the full truth. His childhood was a mix of confusion and pain, wondering why his mother left without a trace. But as time passed, the pain faded into a deep, gnawing emptiness. For 30 years, David lived with unanswered questions and the agony of not knowing what had really happened to her. The lies his father had fed him created a wall between them, and David's perception of the man he once idolized started to deteriorate. Yet the answers he sought seemed always just out of reach. One night, while David was driving home after a particularly exhausting day at work, everything changed in an instant. As he made his way down a familiar street, a woman suddenly dashed out into the middle of the road, causing David to slam on his brakes. His heart raced, and the car swerved to avoid hitting her. But as his headlights illuminated her face, David froze. Standing there before him was a woman who looked exactly like his mother, Ellen. The resemblance was uncanny. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, and his mind went blank. How could this be? Ellen had been missing for 3 decades. His pulse quickened as he looked at the woman who appeared to be in a state of desperation and fear. She looked lost, unkempt, and broken, yet her face was undeniably that of his mother. His emotions ranged from disbelief to confusion. How could this be happening? Was it really his mother, or was this just a cruel trick of fate? The woman seemed frightened, her trembling hands waving, as if trying to apologize for her abrupt appearance in the middle of the street. But her words, spoken in a weak, quivering voice, left David breathless. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again," she muttered, a sense of terror in her voice. Those words struck David like a bolt of lightning. What had happened to her? What was she talking about? Why was she afraid of being locked away? The uncertainty flooded David's mind as he helped the woman into his car, not fully understanding what was going on, but driven by a need to make sense of this strange, painful situation. He rushed her to the hospital, hoping that medical professionals could provide some clarity. His thoughts were in turmoil. Could this really be his mother? If it was, then what had happened to her all these years? The uncertainty gnawed at him. In the hospital, after several tests and examinations, David finally learned the truth. This was indeed Ellen. His mother, who had been missing for 30 years, was alive. But the truth didn't stop there. It only deepened the mystery and the pain. It turned out that Ellen had been locked away in a psychiatric institution for most of those years, and the person responsible for her confinement was none other than Richard, David's father. Richard had signed the order to commit Ellen to the institution, and for decades she had lived in isolation and torment. She had never been mentally ill. She had been trapped in a nightmare, a victim of Richard's cruelty and control. The shocking revelation sent David reeling. His father, the man who had raised him, the man who had claimed to love his family, had torn their lives apart. Ellen had been imprisoned, not because she was sick, but because Richard needed her out of the way to maintain his career and reputation. His ambitions had come before his family, and for 30 years, Ellen had paid the price for his selfishness. David was overwhelmed with anger, sadness, and betrayal. He had spent his whole life believing the lie his father had told him, that Ellen had simply abandoned them. Now, the truth was out, and it was worse than he could have ever imagined. His father had destroyed their family, taken away his mother, and left David to grow up without her. David's childhood memories of longing for his mother, of not understanding why she was gone, now took on new meaning. They were memories of abandonment and deceit. The pain and the anger surged within him like a tidal wave, and he knew he couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. Determined to uncover the full extent of the truth, David began researching hospital records and documents that could explain how his mother had been kept in the institution for so long. After an arduous battle, he finally obtained the documents he needed. The papers revealed that Richard had been the one who had signed the admission forms for Ellen's psychiatric confinement. She had been falsely labeled as mentally ill to justify her removal from their lives. This was the final piece of the puzzle, and the truth hit David like a punch to the stomach. His father had stolen his mother's freedom, and he had done it to serve his own selfish interests. David was determined to take action. He hired a lawyer, Sarah, who helped him gather all the evidence needed to reopen the case. With the truth now in the open, David's story gained media attention. The public was outraged by the cruelty of Richard's actions, and the reputation he had carefully built over the years began to crumble. But Richard remained unrepentant. He defended his actions, claiming that Ellen was too weak to be a suitable partner, that he had done what was necessary for the family. His cold, callous defense only fueled David's rage. He couldn't believe that the man who had once been his hero was capable of such horror. As the trial began, David stood in the courtroom, facing his father. For years, he had felt the weight of his mother's disappearance, but now, in this moment, he had the chance to make Richard face the consequences of his actions. With witness testimony and irrefutable evidence, David was able to prove that Richard had unlawfully committed his mother to a mental institution, stripping her of her freedom for decades. The court found Richard guilty, and while there was no satisfaction in seeing his father punished, David knew that justice had been served. The years of pain, of unanswered questions, of growing up without his mother, those wounds would never fully heal, but at least they had been acknowledged. Ellen was free. She had endured unimaginable suffering, but now, with David by her side, she could begin to heal. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. David vowed to never let his mother live in fear again, to give her the life she deserved, filled with love and peace. And though the journey had been long and painful, they were both determined to move forward, rebuilding their lives one step at a time. The trial had brought justice, but it had also forced David to confront the man his father had become. No amount of punishment could undo the damage Richard had done, but David had made peace with that. It was the beginning of a new chapter for him and Ellen. And this time, they would face the future together stronger, wiser, and free. A son's journey, the painful truth about his father's betrayal. David's world had been built on questions and a deep sense of loss, ever since his mother, Ellen, disappeared when he was just a young boy. For as long as he could remember, he had been searching for answers. Raised by his father, Richard, David lived with the ache of wondering why his mother wasn't there and why no one would give him a clear answer. Richard's explanations were always vague, offering no comfort or understanding, just a cold avoidance of the truth. Ellen's disappearance was a mystery that gnawed at David's soul, and as he grew older, it turned into a silent resentment toward the man who was supposed to be his protector. Richard had always maintained that Ellen had left them of her own volition, that she simply walked out of their lives. But David couldn't believe that. He felt deep down that something was terribly wrong, and that his father wasn't being honest with him. The emotional void that David carried for years, questions without answers, pain without relief, started to consume him. But the answers he was searching for seemed to slip farther away with each passing year. His childhood memories were punctuated with moments of longing and wondering, but no one, especially his father, would provide him with the truth. His mother's absence had created a gap that nothing could fill, not even the years spent with Richard. Though his father tried to act as if everything was normal, David never stopped feeling the sting of her absence. The questions remained. What happened to Ellen? Where had she gone? Why did she leave? Why did his father never tell him the truth? One night, after a grueling day at work, David's life would change in a way he could never have predicted. He was driving home along a quiet street when he suddenly saw a woman dart into the middle of the road. Without thinking, he slammed on the brakes, and the car swerved dangerously. His heart raced as the woman stood frozen in the street. But it wasn't just the fact that she was there, it was her face. As the headlights illuminated her, David felt his heart drop into his stomach. The woman looked exactly like Ellen, his mother. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. She had been missing for so many years. How could this be happening? His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Was this some kind of hallucination? But the woman's face was unmistakable. Every feature was identical to the woman he remembered from his childhood. He couldn't breathe. His mind raced. He got out of the car, trembling, and walked toward the woman, who seemed disoriented and lost. There was something about her that filled David with both fear and an overwhelming sense of familiarity. The woman's eyes were empty, and she was trembling as though she was frightened of him. She stammered a strange plea. "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." The words pierced David's heart. What was she talking about? Locking her up? Why would she be afraid of that? David could hardly bring himself to believe it, but deep down he knew. This woman, this lost, fragile soul, was his mother. His stomach twisted with confusion and anger. What had happened to her? Why had she been reduced to this state? How had his father kept her away from him for all these years, only to leave him in the dark about what had truly happened? The years of unanswered questions and pains surged forward in a wave of fury. His mind was spinning with the reality of it all. His mother had been alive this whole time, suffering, alone, and forgotten. And his father, the man who had been his only source of stability, had lied to him for decades. Determined to get to the truth, David took her to the hospital, hoping that medical professionals could help him make sense of the madness. The doctors confirmed that this woman was indeed Ellen, but the truth of how she had lived these past 30 years was even more devastating than David could have imagined. Ellen had been committed to a psychiatric institution by none other than Richard, her husband, all those years ago. It wasn't that she was mentally ill, it was that his father had wanted to control her, to keep her out of the way for his own selfish reasons. Richard had locked her away, and for 3 decades she had been subjected to unimaginable abuse, hidden from David and the world. David's emotions were a whirlwind: rage, confusion, disbelief, and overwhelming sadness. His father had been the one to destroy their family, to tear apart everything that was once good and whole. David had been raised with lies, with a false sense of security, and now the truth was like a punch to the gut. Richard, the man he had loved and respected, had betrayed him and his mother in the cruelest way possible. Ellen had never abandoned them. She had been locked away, kept from David and the life she should have had. His father had stolen her life, and in doing so, he had stolen David's childhood as well. As the pieces of this dark puzzle came together, David's anger began to turn into a quiet determination. He couldn't let his father's actions go unpunished. He hired a lawyer, Sarah, to help him gather evidence and reopen the case. The documents David uncovered: hospital records, medical reports, and the testimony of a nurse who had witnessed Ellen's suffering painted a horrific picture of what had been done to his mother. Richard had not just abandoned his wife, he had locked her away in a mental institution and left her to suffer alone for 30 years. The media picked up on the story, and Richard's reputation, which he had spent years building, began to crumble. But still, Richard remained cold and indifferent, justifying his actions as necessary for the sake of the family and his career. His lack of remorse only fueled David's resolve. The public outrage grew, and the trial against Richard was set in motion. David stood in the courtroom, face to face with his father, the man who had once been his hero. The emotions were overwhelming, but David knew one thing for sure: he had to make Richard face the consequences of his actions. The court found Richard guilty, but for David, there was no satisfaction in seeing his father punished. He had long ago lost the man he once admired. The trial marked the end of a chapter, but the journey to healing for David and Ellen was just beginning. They moved into a small apartment together, a safe place for Ellen to heal and rebuild her life. It wasn't perfect, but it was a fresh start, one filled with love and understanding. David's pain was far from gone, but as he watched his mother begin to recover, he found a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. No matter how much they had lost, they still had each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered. A long-awaited reunion and a son's search for the truth. For 30 years, John had lived with an aching emptiness in his heart, unable to understand why his mother, Linda, vanished without a trace. As a child, he remembered the warmth of her love, her gentle voice, and the feeling of safety she gave him. But one day, that safety was ripped away when she disappeared, and no one, not even his father, could explain where she had gone. His father, Greg, told him that Linda had simply left their family, that she had walked out on them. As John grew older, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more he thought about it, the more questions plagued his mind. Why had she left without a word? Why had his father seemed so unconcerned? His father's vague answers only fueled his suspicions, and deep down, John knew that the truth had been hidden from him. The years that passed were marked by an unyielding desire to uncover what had really happened to his mother. With each passing birthday and milestone, Linda's absence weighed heavier on John's heart. He felt lost, alone in a world where the answers to the most important question of his life had been deliberately withheld. Despite the pain, he tried to keep his life moving forward, but there was always that hollow feeling, that ache for answers that never seemed to come. Greg never spoke about his mother, and his attempts to cover up the truth made John even more determined to find the answers himself. It was a cold winter night when everything changed. John, now an adult, was driving home from work, his mind filled with the usual swirl of frustration and exhaustion. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he fought to stay awake. But as he turned a corner, something happened that would change his life forever. A woman darted out into the middle of the road, forcing him to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched, and for a moment, it seemed like the car would crash. The woman stood frozen, her trembling figure barely visible in the headlights. But as the light from the car illuminated her face, John felt his heart stop. There, in front of him, was a woman who looked eerily familiar. Her features, her expression, the way she stood, it was all so reminiscent of his mother. The resemblance was undeniable. His breath caught in his chest as he realized what he was seeing. Linda? Could it be her? After 30 years of wondering and longing, was she standing in front of him now? The woman looked dazed, disheveled, and frightened, a stark contrast to the warm, nurturing mother he remembered. She stood there, shaking, and in a barely audible voice, she muttered, "Don't take me. Don't lock me up again." Those words struck John like a bolt of lightning. Lock me up again? What was she talking about? Why did she seem so terrified? He couldn't process it, but one thing was clear. This woman, despite how much she had changed, was Linda. His mother had been missing for so many years, and here she was, standing in front of him in a state of despair. The shock of the moment left John frozen in place, unsure of what to do. But instinct took over, and he helped the woman into his car, deciding to take her to the hospital to get some answers. The drive to the hospital was tense, filled with confusion and anxiety. John's mind raced as he wondered what had happened to his mother all these years. Why had she been living in such a state? What had caused her to disappear, and why had no one come forward with the truth? The questions flooded his mind, but he didn't have any answers. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed his worst fears. This woman was indeed Linda. But the truth about what had happened to her during those lost years was more horrifying than John could have imagined. As the doctors ran tests and examined Linda, they uncovered the details of her troubled past. She had been confined to a psychiatric institution by Greg, her own husband, 30 years ago. Greg had had her committed, not because she was mentally ill, but because he couldn't deal with her anymore. Linda had been locked away and forgotten, hidden from John and the world. Greg had left his wife to suffer, never once revealing the truth to his son. The years of emotional and physical abuse had left Linda a shell of the woman she once was. Her memory was fractured, and the years of suffering had broken her spirit. John's anger and disbelief were overwhelming. How could his father have done this? How could the man who was supposed to be his protector have treated Linda like this? Greg had kept his mother locked away, isolated and alone, and he had never once told John the truth. The betrayal was too much for John to handle. For all these years, he had believed that his mother had simply abandoned him, but now he knew the painful truth. It was his father who had abandoned both of them. Determined to bring Greg to justice, John enlisted the help of a lawyer, Sarah, and began digging into the records from the psychiatric institution where Linda had been held. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. Greg had signed the papers that committed Linda to the institution, and he had done so for his own selfish reasons. He had never cared about his wife's well-being, only his own ambition and desire for control. He had sacrificed his wife's happiness and his son's childhood for the sake of his career. The truth was a crushing blow, and John's sense of betrayal was deep. But the anger that burned inside John was not going to be left to fester. He filed a lawsuit against his father, seeking justice for the years of suffering his mother had endured. The case quickly gained media attention, and the public outrage against Greg was palpable. As the truth spread, Greg's reputation, which he had carefully built over the years, began to crumble. The man who had once been a respected figure in the community was now seen for what he truly was, a cruel, selfish tyrant. The trial was a long, painful process for John and Linda. They relived the horrors of the past, but in the end, Greg was held accountable for his actions. He was found guilty of unlawfully imprisoning Linda and causing her years of emotional and physical harm. The victory, however, was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past would never fully fade. With the trial behind them, John and Linda began to rebuild their lives. They moved into a small apartment where Linda could begin her recovery. It wasn't easy, but with John's love and support, Linda slowly started to heal. As they walked through the park together, Linda would smile, her eyes filled with a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. The past could never be erased, but together, they had found a way to move forward. For John, the journey was one of deep emotional growth. He had learned that the pain of the past could be healed through love, forgiveness, and justice. As he watched his mother regain her strength and happiness, he knew that the years of suffering had not been in vain. They had found each other again, and that was all that mattered. Together, they would walk a new path, one filled with hope and the promise of a better future. Life can be filled with unexpected twists, often leaving us with scars from the past. However, it's never too late to seek healing and closure. The story of John and his mother, Linda, teaches us that forgiveness and justice have the power to transform even the deepest wounds. John's determination to uncover the truth, despite years of suffering and confusion, shows that seeking answers and confronting the past is not only essential for personal growth, but also for finding peace. While the pain of betrayal may never fully fade, it is through love, resilience, and the pursuit of justice that we can rebuild our lives. We must remember that it's never too late to reclaim our happiness and to show kindness and compassion to others who are still healing. In moments of difficulty, we can find strength not only in ourselves, but in the love and support of those around us. As we grow older, we understand that the wounds of the past shape us, but they don't define our future. With courage and the right support, it's possible to let go of what holds us back and embrace a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of peace. Life may not always be fair, but we can always find a way to make it right. Thank you for watching this touching family story. We hope it touched your heart and inspired you. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories TH for more heartwarming stories. Stay tuned for the next one. Tuned for the next